Emily walked nervously through the towering gates of the Hart estate for the first time. Her heart raced as she approached the grand mansion that stood like an imposing fortress in front of her. She had heard stories about the billionaire who owned it, Alexander Hart, a man whose reputation for being ruthless and cold as ice was known by all those who worked in the city. But she had no choice. She needed this job to make ends meet. She had no family to turn to and no other options. The moment she stepped inside the door, she could feel the weight of the mansion pressing down on her. Its cold marble floors and high ceilings gave the place an air of indifference. She walked through the hallways, her footsteps echoing in the silence. When she finally arrived at the kitchen, she met the staff who were polite but distant. None of them seemed eager to engage her, and she quickly realized that her position here would not be an easy one. As she got to work, tidying up the kitchen, she heard a voice coming from the hallway, the unmistakable sound of someone approaching, footsteps growing louder. She turned just in time to see him step into the room. Alexander Hart himself, the man who had built this empire of wealth and isolation. His presence was commanding, tall and broad-shouldered. He wore a crisp suit that seemed almost too perfect. His face was chiseled with sharp angles, his dark eyes piercing, as if he could see right through her. She froze for a moment, unsure of what to do or say. But Alexander didn't even acknowledge her. He simply walked past her, his gaze never once shifting to meet hers. He moved like a man who was used to being alone in a world where no one dared to challenge him or disturb his peace. Emily felt a wave of frustration, but quickly pushed it aside. She had to stay professional, no matter how rude he seemed. As the day went on, she continued with her tasks, keeping her head down and trying her best to avoid any further interactions with him. But as the afternoon wore on, she found herself in the hallway again. This time she was carrying a tray of coffee for his study. She knocked at the door and was told to enter without hesitation. She opened the door and stepped into the dimly lit room, where Alexander sat at a large mahogany desk, his back turned to her. He didn't even look up when she entered. Instead, he waved a hand as if dismissing her presence. Without a word, Emily placed the tray on the desk carefully, but as she did so, she accidentally knocked over a stack of important-looking papers. They scattered across the floor. She cursed under her breath and bent down quickly to gather them, her face flushed with embarrassment. Just as she stood up, she heard his voice, cold and cutting. "Emily, you can't even manage to carry a simple tray without making a mess. What else are you good for?" She felt the sting of his words cutting deep. Her hands shook as she tried to hide her frustration. But before she could respond, Alexander stood up from his desk, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, and walked past her without a second glance. Just like that, he left her in the room with her heart pounding in her chest, the words replaying in her mind. As she stood there in silence, a part of her wanted to scream, but another part told her to hold it together. She had to survive here somehow, and no matter how rude he was, she couldn't afford to lose this job. She just had to keep her head down and carry on. The next few days passed in a blur of code encounters and stifling silence. Every time Emily entered a room, Alexander was there, his sharp eyes studying her with a mix of disdain and indifference. He barely acknowledged her presence beyond the occasional comment that cut through the air like a blade. His words were always wrapped in scorn, and his every movement seemed calculated to remind her of her place as nothing more than a maid in his world. Yet she couldn't escape the feeling that there was something more beneath the surface, something she couldn't quite grasp. He was a man of extremes, either completely detached or mercilessly harsh, and though he never said it aloud, she could sense his loneliness like an unspoken truth lingering in the space between them. Emily tried to focus on her work and push away the feelings of frustration and confusion that rose within her every time he looked at her. It wasn't long before she found herself at the receiving end of yet another scolding. She had been cleaning the living room when she heard the sound of Alexander's voice from behind her, his footsteps heavy as he approached. "Emily, I told you this room needed to be spotless, but clearly you don't have the attention to detail I expect," he said, his voice sharp. She froze and turned to face him, her heart already pounding in her chest. She had been cleaning diligently for hours, but the mere suggestion that she wasn't doing enough stung deeply. She fought the urge to defend herself. Instead, she stood there silently, her gaze focused on the floor, avoiding his eyes. Alexander took a few steps closer, towering over her with a look of impatience on his face. This was the second time today he had caught her slacking off. He said coldly, I won't tolerate inefficiency here. You need to prove you can handle this job, or you'll be out before you even get comfortable. Emily felt a wave of frustration building inside her. It wasn't the first time he had belittled her, but today it felt different. The words seemed to hang in the air, suffocating her. She wanted to argue, to stand up for herself, but she knew that doing so would only make things worse. Instead, she forced a small nod and muttered an apology. He let out a dismissive sigh and walked away without another word, leaving Emily standing there with a mixture of anger and humiliation building inside her. She wanted to yell at him, to tell him what she thought of his cruel behavior, but she held it in. She couldn't afford to make waves. Not yet, not when she was so new to this world. She took a deep breath and tried to push the bitterness aside. There had to be a way to survive here and maybe even earn his respect. But the more she saw of him, the harder that seemed to be. She had heard the rumors of his cold heart and harsh nature, but seeing it firsthand left her feeling empty and unsure of how to move forward. Yet, even as the days wore on and the tension between them built, Emily found herself wondering why he was so angry all the time. What had made him this way? Why did he push everyone away, especially her? She couldn't help but feel that there was more to his story than he let on. But for now, she would have to bide her time and figure out a way to navigate the maze of his complicated world. One evening, after a long day of endless chores, Emily found herself working late into the night. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the mansion's old pipes. As she scrubbed the floors in one of the many long hallways, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. They were slow, deliberate, like the weight of each step was meant to make a statement. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw him rounding the corner. Alexander was walking toward her, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead. She quickly stood up and moved to the side to let him pass, but just as he drew near, he stopped and turned to face her. Emily tried to keep her expression neutral as she stood before him. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. He was staring at her in a way that made her skin prickle, but she couldn't quite understand why. Something in his gaze seemed different this time. There was no anger, no sharp criticism, just a quiet intensity that seemed almost vulnerable. And for a brief moment, she wondered if she had misjudged him. But then he spoke, his voice softer than usual. You're still here late, he said, his tone lacking the usual edge. She looked up at him, surprised by the question. She nodded and quickly explained, I had to finish cleaning the floors, Miss Hart. I didn't want to leave anything undone. She expected him to scold her for working too much or for being inefficient, but instead he remained silent, his gaze lingering on her face as if deep in thought. Emily shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say next. It was rare that Alexander spoke to her at all, and even rarer that his words were anything but sharp. But tonight it was different. Tonight there was something in the air between them that felt almost human. She could feel her heart racing as the seconds ticked by, and she wondered if he could hear it too. It felt like the walls between them were starting to crack. But before she could process what was happening, he abruptly turned and started walking away without a word. Emily stood there, frozen for a moment, unsure of what just occurred. She had been so caught off guard by his sudden change in demeanor that she hadn't been able to respond. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them that night, something she didn't quite understand. She was left with more questions than answers, and an odd sense of unease gnawing at her. The next day, she tried to push it all out of her mind and focus on her work. But no matter what she did, she couldn't stop thinking about Alexander. There was something about him that pulled her in, even when he was cold and distant, something that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than the man who constantly pushed her away. As the days went on, she began to notice small moments where their interactions felt different. The way he would pause before speaking to her, as if considering his words. The rare times when he actually looked at her, not with the usual disdain, but with something more contemplative. She told herself that she was imagining it, that she was reading too much into things. But the truth was that she couldn't deny the strange pull she felt toward him, despite everything he had done to make her feel small and insignificant. There was something in the way he sometimes looked at her that made her heart flutter, and no matter how much she tried to fight it, she found herself longing for something more than just a cold professional relationship. She couldn't help but wonder if he was feeling it too, if the tension between them was leading somewhere she wasn't sure she wanted to go. But the possibility of finding out terrified her. One night, not long after their brief exchange in the hallway, Emily found herself awake in the quiet of her room, unable to shake the strange tension that had settled over her. She had just finished her daily duties and was about to head to bed when she heard a faint noise outside her door. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, but then she heard it again, the sound of someone moving quietly down the hall. Her curiosity piqued. Emily slipped out of bed and quietly crept to the door. Peeking out into the hallway, she gasped when she saw Alexander standing near the stairwell, his posture rigid and his expression tense, as if he were deep in thought or perhaps lost in some troubling memory. Emily hesitated, unsure if she should approach him or stay hidden in her room, but before she could decide, Alexander turned and saw her standing there in the doorway. His eyes locked onto hers for a moment, and she felt her heart skip a beat. His gaze wasn't angry or dismissive like usual. Instead, it was almost vulnerable. His mouth parted slightly, as if he were going to say something, but the words never came. Instead, he simply stood there as if waiting for her to speak. Emily gathered her courage and took a step forward. "Miss Hart," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you all right?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved from her face to the floor and then back again, a flicker of something soft passing through them. He looked like a man who had been carrying the weight of the world for far too long without anyone to share it with. In that moment, Emily saw him differently. She saw the cracks in his perfect facade, the man who had everything yet nothing at all. She wanted to reach out and say something comforting, but she wasn't sure what to say, so she stood there silently waiting for him to respond. He finally broke the silence in a voice that was barely audible. "No one ever stays here," he said, his tone flat, but there was an underlying pain that made Emily's heart ache. "No one stays with me," he continued, and his words felt like an admission of something much deeper than he intended. She watched as he ran a hand through his dark hair, his frustration evident. Emily was struck by how raw and honest his words were, how different he seemed without his usual arrogance. She took a cautious step closer to him, unsure if she should intrude on his private moment, but something inside her told her that he wasn't just the cold billionaire anymore. He was someone who had been alone for too long. Alexander Hart was a man who had built walls around his heart to protect himself from the world, and now those walls seemed to be crumbling in front of her. She didn't know what came over her, but before she could stop herself, she spoke in a soft voice. "I'm here, Mr. Hart," she said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." His eyes flickered at her words, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and started walking down the hallway, his movements stiff and distant, as if he had suddenly realized how much he had let himself show. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, watching him go. Her heart raced in her chest, and she realized with a sudden clarity that this wasn't just about the job anymore. There was something about him, something that made her feel connected to him in a way she didn't understand. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him, or the strange hope that maybe, just maybe, there was more to their relationship than she had ever imagined. The days following that night felt different to Emily. There was an unspoken shift between them, something subtle but undeniable. She found herself glancing at Alexander more often when he wasn't looking. His presence lingered in the air, even when he wasn't around, and every time their paths crossed, there was an odd tension between them that neither of them acknowledged, but both could feel. It was like the mansion had become a stage for a drama neither of them had signed up for, and yet somehow they were both playing their parts. The change was most noticeable during the rare moments when they spoke. Alexander's tone had softened ever so slightly, and Emily began to notice that he wasn't as dismissive as he had been before. She still felt the sting of his words sometimes, but it wasn't as cutting as it used to be. One afternoon, as she cleaned the library, she heard his footsteps approaching once again. She expected him to walk past without a word, but this time he stopped just a few feet away. She turned to face him, and for a moment, Neither of them said anything. The silence between them was thick. But it was different. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was curious. She met his gaze and saw something there, something almost vulnerable. His eyes weren't the heart-piercing eyes of the man who had always looked down on her. Instead, they were searching, almost as if he were looking for something in her. He broke the silence first. "I need your help," he said, his voice hesitant. Emily blinked in surprise. She had never heard him ask for help before, let alone in such a vulnerable tone. She nodded cautiously. "What do you need?" she asked, her heart beating faster than she expected. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "There's a meeting tomorrow with some important clients," he said. "I need you to help me prepare my notes." He looked almost reluctant to ask, but she could see the genuine need behind his request. She nodded again. "Of course, Miss Hart," she said. She didn't understand why he had come to her for something so personal, but something about it felt like a breakthrough, like maybe he was finally willing to let her in just a little bit more than before. The next day they met in the study to go over his notes. As she sat beside him at his desk, she could feel the tension in the room shift again. It wasn't like before when he had been distant and unapproachable. Now there was a quiet focus between them, a strange partnership that neither of them had expected. He would occasionally glance at her, asking her opinion on certain points, or even just quietly thanking her when she caught a mistake. The small moments felt like small victories in a world that had always felt so cold and distant to both of them. For the first time since she had arrived, Emily began to feel like she belonged here, like her presence mattered, and not just as a maid, but as someone who could offer more, something beyond the duties she had been hired to perform. As they worked side by side, something shifted in her heart. She had never seen this side of Alexander before. The man who seemed invincible now seemed fragile in his own way, and despite everything he had done to her before, she found herself wanting to know more, wanting to understand what had shaped him into the person he was. She looked at him as he focused on the papers before him and wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to see her differently too. But the thought was fleeting and she quickly pushed it aside. After all, they still had a long way to go before they could even begin to understand each other. The following days brought an unexpected change in the rhythm of their interactions. Alexander had become less aloof, his sharp words softened into polite requests, and his coldness began to thaw ever so slightly. Emily found herself drawn into conversations with him that were no longer just about work. They were about everything and nothing at all. In the evenings, when they passed each other in the halls, there was no longer an awkward silence. She would catch him looking at her in a way that felt different, like he was trying to understand her rather than dismiss her entirely. Their exchanges were brief, but there was something between them now, something unspoken that neither of them dared to name. It was during one of these moments that Emily found herself in the study again. This time Alexander was sitting at his desk, looking over some paperwork as usual, but this time something about the way he sat there seemed different. There was an exhaustion in his posture that hadn't been there before, and for a split second Emily felt a strange wave of sympathy. She had seen him at his sharpest, but she had never seen him vulnerable, not like this. She hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room. Without thinking, she asked, "Is everything all right, my heart?" He didn't look up immediately, but then he sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. "I have to make some decisions that could change everything," he said, his tone dark and heavy. The words seemed to hang in the air, and Emily couldn't help but feel the gravity of them. She had never seen him so open, so unguarded. It was as if in this moment all the walls he had built around himself were crumbling away. She took a step closer to him, unsure of what to say, but she found herself offering something she hadn't intended to say. "I'm here if you want to talk," she said, her voice soft and genuine. He looked up at her, his eyes searching her face for a moment before he leaned back in his chair. He seemed to consider her offer for a long time before finally nodding slowly. "I'm not used to people offering their help," he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. It was clear that his life had been shaped by years of isolation and distrust. Emily could see it now more clearly than ever. The man who had pushed everyone away, the man who had built an empire on his own, had never learned to rely on anyone but himself. She could see the pain beneath the surface, the loneliness that had been buried for so long. But in that moment, she also saw something else. She saw the man behind the facade, the man who had been fighting his demons in solitude for far too long, and despite everything he had done to her, despite the harshness and the coldness, there was something inside her that wanted to be there for him. She wanted to help him in a way no one else ever had. She didn't know why, but she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him, not anymore. As she stood there in the quiet of the study, Emily felt the air between them change once again. The distance that had separated them for so long seemed to shrink, and though neither of them spoke, the unspoken understanding between them was palpable. It was as if they both knew something was shifting, something that neither of them fully understood yet, but both were willing to explore together. The next few days brought an uncomfortable quiet between them. The tension that had been building up between Emily and Alexander was now palpable, as if the smallest spark would ignite something neither of them were ready to face. Alexander had become more distant again, his sharp words and cold demeanor returning with a vengeance, and Emily couldn't understand why. It was as though the fragile connection they had shared was being pushed away by an invisible force. Every time their paths crossed, she could feel the weight of his gaze, but there was no warmth in it anymore. He seemed withdrawn and preoccupied with something that kept him at a distance. Despite her efforts to remain professional, Emily couldn't help but feel the sting of his sudden indifference. It was as though the man she had seen vulnerable in the study was gone, completely replaced by the man who had been dismissive and cruel from the very start. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, that something had shifted in him. She just didn't know what it was. One afternoon, she was cleaning the grand dining room when she heard the sound of voices coming from the hallway. She froze when she recognized Alexander's voice. It was raised in frustration and anger, but she couldn't make out the words. She had never heard him this angry before. The sound of another voice made her hesitate even more. The voice was unfamiliar to her, but it had a certain authority to it that made her feel uneasy. She crept toward the door, trying to listen without being seen, but she could only catch snippets of the conversation. They were speaking too quickly for her to understand fully. But she caught the word betrayal several times, and she felt a chill run down her spine. Her heart began to race as she wondered what was going on inside the mansion. Was Alexander in trouble? Had something happened that was forcing him to act out in anger? The door to the dining room creaked, and she quickly stepped back into the shadows, just in time to avoid being seen. The conversation outside continued, but she couldn't bring herself to listen any longer. Something told her that whatever was happening wasn't something she was supposed to know about. She couldn't ignore the knot of worry that had formed in her stomach. She had seen Alexander angry before, but this was different. It was deeper, more personal, and it left her with a feeling of dread. She tried to focus on her work, but the unease continued to gnaw at her. As the hours passed, she couldn't stop thinking about what she had overheard. The feeling of betrayal had sounded so intense, so raw, and it made her wonder if it had anything to do with her. At that moment, she realized that she was becoming more entangled in his world than she had ever intended to be. She had always been careful to keep her distance from him, but now it seemed impossible. There was too much at stake, too much emotion she couldn't deny anymore. The next day, she was summoned to the study again, and when she entered, she found Alexander standing by the window, his back turned to her. He didn't acknowledge her presence at first, and she stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. She opened her mouth to speak, but he turned to face her suddenly, his face hard and set in a way she hadn't seen in a while. His eyes were cold and guarded, and she felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. Before she could say anything, he spoke. "Emily," he said, his voice low and controlled, "I need you to pack your things. You're being dismissed effective." Immediately, she froze, the words hitting her like a punch to the gut. The room seemed to spin as her mind raced. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had done everything right, had worked hard and kept her distance. So why now? Why, after everything they had shared, was he letting her go? She opened her mouth to protest, but the words stuck in her throat, and the tears that had been threatening to fall now blurred her vision. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, unable to comprehend the words that had just left his mouth. The coldness in his voice was like a slap to her face, and for a moment she couldn't find her voice to respond. She wanted to ask why, wanted to demand an explanation, But the hurt in his eyes stopped her. Before she could speak anything, she could see the walls had gone back up completely, and the man who had once seemed so vulnerable was now completely untouchable. She wanted to believe that this was all some kind of mistake, that there had been some misunderstanding, but she could see it in his expression that he had made up his mind. Without hesitation and without care, she felt a rush of emotions, fear, confusion, and anger floated her chest, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. But she forced herself to stay calm. She had to fight this. She couldn't just walk away, not after everything she had been through. She had to understand what had changed. Alexander, please, she said, her voice shaking with uncertainty. I don't understand what's going on. Why are you doing this? The words felt heavy in the silence, but Alexander didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at her with an unreadable expression, like he was debating whether to say anything at all. Then finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice low and tinged with frustration. Because you're in the way, he said sharply. You're distracting me, and I can't afford distractions. Emily felt as though the breath had been knocked out of her. She hadn't expected those words to cut so deep, but they did. They made her feel small, insignificant, and like she was nothing more than a passing annoyance to him. All of the progress they had made, all the moments that had made her believe there was something more between them, seemed to have vanished in the blink of an eye. Her heart hurt as the truth of his words sank in. You don't even care, she whispered, her voice breaking. She couldn't believe it. She didn't know if she was angry or heartbroken or both, and it terrified her to feel so exposed in front of him, but she couldn't hold it in anymore. She had given so much of herself to this job, to understanding him, to finding something real beneath the surface, but now it felt like none of it had mattered. He was right. Though she thought she had been more than just the maid to him, it had always been one-sided. After all, he had only ever treated her as a tool to be used and dismissed. When it no longer suited him, she wanted to yell at him, to scream and tell him everything she had been holding back. But something inside her told her to stay silent. Instead, she took a shaky breath and nodded slowly, as if the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, her voice barely audible. I'll pack my things, she said, feeling the weight of the finality in her words. She turned to leave, but before she could take another step, she heard him speak again. Don't go, he said, his voice softer now, almost uncertain. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned back to look at him. Alexander's face was still tense, but there was something different in his eyes. Now it wasn't the coldness she had grown used to, it was something more complicated, something that made her hesitate. He took a step toward her, his gaze never leaving hers. Emily, don't go, he repeated this time. His voice was laced with regret and something else, something that made her wonder if he was actually afraid of losing her. The uncertainty in his words confused her. She had no idea what he wanted anymore. But in that moment, she realized she was standing at a crossroads with him. The decision she made now would shape everything from here on out. Emily stood motionless, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. She had come here expecting the worst, but now the words he spoke hung in the air like a fragile thread between them. Don't go, his voice was softer this time, more vulnerable than anything she had ever heard from him before. She felt her pulse quicken as she turned to face him, completely unsure of how to respond. She wanted to scream at him, to ask why, after everything he had said and done, why was he asking her to stay? But at the same time, something in his eyes made her pause, something that spoke of regret and fear, something that told her there was more to this than she had understood. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself before speaking. You told me to pack my things, she said, her voice quiet and unsure. But you're telling me not to leave now, after everything you've said to me? Why the sudden change in your mind? She felt her throat tighten as the words left her lips. She didn't know whether to be angry or relieved, and it was a struggle to make sense of the emotions that were swirling inside her. Alexander didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, like he was trying to find the right words, or maybe the courage to say them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and hesitant. I've been a fool, he admitted, his gaze shifting away from hers. I've pushed people away my entire life. I've never let anyone in, not really. And now that you're here, it's like everything I've built is falling apart. I can't seem to keep myself from getting tangled up in you, and I don't know what to do with that. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself. But there was something almost fragile in his tone. The man who had once seemed so unapproachable was now standing before her with raw honesty. Emily felt her heart ache at the sight of him, so vulnerable, so uncertain. He had never shown her this side of himself before, and the realization that he was admitting his weaknesses to her made her feel like she was seeing the real Alexander for the first time, the one who wasn't just a cold billionaire, but a man who had been hurt in ways she couldn't fully understand yet. And maybe that was why he had pushed her away so many times. He had been terrified of letting someone in, terrified of what it would mean to be vulnerable again. She couldn't help but feel a wave of empathy for him. The walls he had built were crumbling now, and all of a sudden she found herself standing in the middle of his unraveling world, the world that she had never been a part of, but now realized she wanted to be part of. She didn't know what would happen next, but in this moment, she knew that she couldn't walk away, not now, not when everything had changed between them. She took a step closer to him, her heart pounding in her chest, and for the first time since this all began, she reached out and gently touched his arm. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like it meant everything. She met his eyes, and without thinking, she said, "I'm not going anywhere either," she whispered, her voice barely above her breath. Her words felt like a promise to herself and to him. She didn't know what would come next, what path they would walk together, but for the first time since she had arrived at this mansion, she felt like she was ready to face whatever came their way, as long as they were facing it together. And in that moment, it felt like the beginning of something new, something that neither of them had anticipated, but both of them were finally ready to explore.